The lecture hall of the Interstellar Academy of Xenobiology held 200 students from 43 different species, and then there was Lyra Vera. She sat in the third row, her brown skin flushed pink from the climate control system that the Academy kept calibrated for species with lower thermal tolerances. Her dark hair was pulled back, her notebook open, her pen moving steadily even as half the room had already gone quiet with dread. Professor Kale Veyron stood at the front, his four-fingered hands folded neatly behind his back, his silver-blue scales catching the light as he turned toward the holographic display. His species, the Valorians, had been spacefaring for 11,000 years. He had 3 doctoral degrees and had published work that reshaped galactic understanding of planetary habitability. He was also, as Lyra had quietly discovered in her first week, deeply, sincerely certain that humans were a clerical error in the galactic record. Today, Professor Veyron said, his translator implant rendering his words into perfect standard galactic, we will be discussing Tier 5 hostile biospheres. He clicked to the next slide. More commonly referred to in academic circles as Deathworlds. A murmur rippled through the lecture hall. Lyra watched 2 Keth students in the row ahead of her press close together. The Keth were insectoid, fragile-limbed, and had evolved on a planet so calm that their species had no word for predator until they reached the stars. Deathworlds, Veyron continued, are defined by 4 primary criteria. First, persistent megafauna with active predatory behavior. Second, environmental volatility exceeding Class 3 on the Halcyon scale. Third, atmospheric or biospheric toxicity sufficient to compromise unshielded biology. Fourth, he paused for emphasis, an evolutionary pressure so extreme that survival itself becomes the dominant selective force. He let that hang in the air. These worlds, he said softly, are not colonized. They are not inhabited. They are avoided. The galactic consensus is clear, sapient life does not emerge from Deathworlds. The conditions are simply too hostile for the development of higher cognition. He clicked to the next image, a rotating planet shrouded in storm systems. Cognition requires stability. It requires safety. A species that spends every generation running from predators does not have the cognitive surplus to develop language, art, mathematics, civilization. He turned to face the class. This, he said, is settled science. Lyra's pen stopped moving. She looked at the planet on the screen. She looked at the storm systems. She tilted her head slightly. Then she raised her hand. The room noticed. It always noticed when Lyra raised her hand. She was the only human at the Interstellar Academy's Veres campus, transferred in on a joint academic exchange program that most of the faculty had openly described as experimental in a tone that meant probably a mistake. Professor Veyron looked at her hand for a moment the way one might look at a mild but unexpected weather event. "Miss Vera," he said. "Professor." Her voice was calm. "I just want to make sure I'm understanding correctly. You're saying that sapient life cannot emerge from a Tier 5 hostile biosphere?" "That is correct. And that's settled science. Published in the Galactic Journal of Xenobiology, confirmed across 14 independent research institutions, yes." "Right." Lyra nodded slowly. "What's the Halcyon scale rating for Earth?" The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence. The kind that happens when everyone in a room knows something that one person apparently doesn't, and they're waiting to see how the person finds out. Professor Veyron's scales shifted slightly, a Valorian tell for discomfort that Lyra had also quietly learned in her first week. "Earth," he said carefully, "is classified as a Tier 4? 4.8, Lyra said. It was reclassified in the 3rd edition of the Galactic Habitability Index. 4.8. Which, if I'm reading the scale correctly, is functionally Tier 5. She paused. "Also, the megafauna criteria, we have, or had, creatures that outmass most registered Tier 5 predators. And our atmospheric oxygen content is technically above the ignition threshold, which I think counts as environmental volatility." The Keth students in front of her had turned around to stare. The point, Veyron said, recovering, is not the precise decimal. I'm also curious about the cognition argument. Lyra flipped back a page in her notebook. You said that survival pressure prevents cognitive development. But from an evolutionary standpoint, wouldn't consistent, extreme survival pressure actually accelerate certain kinds of cognitive development? Pattern recognition, social coordination, tool use, predictive modeling of predator behavior? She looked up. Those are all foundational cognitive skills. And they'd all be under enormous selective pressure on a death world. Miss Vera, the consensus. Also, she said, and now her voice had gone very quiet and very even, I grew up in northern Canada. Which, for context, has wolves, bears, moose, extreme seasonal temperature variation, and weeks every winter where exposed skin will develop frostbite in under 10 minutes. She tilted her head. I walked to school. The room was completely silent now. Professor Veyron stared at her. That is, he said slowly, not the same as. My grandmother lived in a rural area of Kerala. Monsoon floods, king cobra territory, temperatures that would exceed the comfort threshold for 6 species in this room. Lyra gestured around the lecture hall. She was a mathematician. Published 40 papers. Lived to 91. She paused. She used to kill her own chickens for dinner. Something happened in the lecture hall that Lyra had not quite expected. The Keth students weren't just staring now. They were leaning in. Across the room, a cluster of Drethaliu blue-gray, hulking, from a mid-range Class 3 world, had gone very still in the way that meant rapt attention in their body language. The argument that stability is required for sapience, Lyra continued, and now she wasn't really challenging Veyron so much as just talking. The way she talked when something interested her, assumes that stability is the baseline. But what if instability is the baseline? What if the pressure doesn't prevent cognition? What if it builds it, faster, and stranger, and more laterally than it develops anywhere else? She looked at her notebook. Humans didn't just develop language. We developed lying. Do you know how cognitively complex it is to model another mind's beliefs accurately enough to deliberately give them false information? You need theory of mind for that. We were doing it before we had written language. Professor Veyron's 4 fingers had unfolded from behind his back. He was gripping the edge of the lecture podium. We also, Lyra said, almost as an afterthought, domesticated wolves. A small sound came from somewhere in the back of the room. It might have been a Drethali making the clicking noise that translated, roughly, as that's insane. For context, Lyra said, looking up, wolves are apex predators that hunt in coordinated packs. We took them, bred them selectively over generations, and turned them into animals that now sleep in our beds and protect our children. She paused. We did this on purpose. We thought it was a good idea. Miss Vera. We also domesticated cats, which, from a behavioral standpoint, made basically no sense, but we did it anyway because we liked them. She closed her notebook. I'm not saying the research is wrong, Professor. I'm saying that Earth is a data point that doesn't fit the model, and when a data point doesn't fit the model, the correct scientific response isn't to classify the data point as an exception. She met his eyes calmly. It's to revise the model. The lecture hall was quiet for a long moment. Professor Kale Veyron, who had 3 doctoral degrees and 11,000 years of Valorian civilizational confidence behind him, looked at the human girl in the 3rd row. She looked back at him, pen in hand, notebook closed, perfectly relaxed. He thought about a species that walked to school through wolf territory. That did mathematics in Cobra country. That took the apex predator of their world, looked at it, and thought, I want one. For my house. As a companion. He thought about 4.8 on the Halcyon scale. He thought about lying as a cognitive milestone. He cleared his throat. We will, he said carefully, be revisiting this section of the curriculum. Lyra nodded pleasantly and opened her notebook again. In the back of the room, the Drethali were still clicking. The Keth student directly in front of Lyra turned around one more time. Her compound eyes were wide. Her translator rendered her voice as barely a whisper. "Your world," the Keth student said. "Is it really like that?" Lyra considered the question honestly. "It's actually pretty nice," she said. "Most of the time. You get used to it." The Keth student stared at her for 3 full seconds. Then she turned back around and wrote something very quickly in her own notebook. Lyra suspected it was "Do not visit Earth." She was probably right.